Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Harare Conversations, Language, Power, Identity, with Lineo Segoete. She's a storyteller and creative in the form of a writer, researcher, photographer, and archivist. She's also the co-director of, oh my God, it's a...
Once Upon a Time.
Once Upon a Time, Literary Arts. The co-convener of the Global Research Collective, Another Roadmap School, and the 2016-2017 Hubert Humphrey Fellow from Vanderbilt University. Please join me in welcoming Lineo. So Lineo and I are going to talk about quite a lot of things. We're going to explore transgressive words and worlds, hopefully. Mm-hmm. I'm going to maybe start off by asking you, what does it mean for you and your practice to imagine societies rooted in process rather than colonial institutions?
Societies what?
Rooted in process rather than colonial institutions.
Okay, so we've reached.
Did you switch it on?
I don't know. He switched it on.
No, this one.
Oh, this one. Sorry. We're going through a process right now, if I may call it that, of questioning and interrogating the things that kind of define our society, especially as Africans. We cannot pretend that when colonization ended, everything ended. That came with it also stopped, right? There are still remnants of it. There are still things we need to remember about where we come from. And about who we are. And that interrogation or that process of questioning and that process of wonder, I think, is very important, because we cannot, as we look at history, we cannot go back to history. We need to think about how it applies to our present and the kind of future that we want, right? And since we see that there's a problem in the present, what kind of future do we want to define for ourselves, whereby we are not governed by the things that govern society currently? Like being told what to think, being told what to believe in, being told what to wear, all those things. So I think it's critical, yeah.
Okay. Maybe this goes back, is it me? This goes back to the interrogation. What are your feelings about decolonization as a project and as a program?
Decolonization has to be personal, I think, because we can't just look at it as this external thing. It's looking at how it applies in our everyday lives. You know, when you make a comment about someone, is that truly representative of your thinking or of the way that you've been programmed? You know, we can talk about decolonizing the curriculum, for example, at school, where when I was in high school and when I was, in secondary school and such, the books that we read, the only ones that really resonated with me were the ones that had to do with my language, because that's where I learned about culture. Everything else was a bit foreign. You know, the illustrations in the book were foreign, the writing, the language itself was foreign. It did not resonate with me in terms of what I saw around me. You know, so imagine a child who lives in a rural place and they learn about spaceships, for example. But they are not told about spaceships in terms that they can relate to as far as their environment is concerned. So they don't know what let's say, an observatory is, because they've never seen one, right? But there are things that you can relate to there, perhaps, that then can bring them in and make them relate to what a spaceship is. Like you can make an example of, I can't think of anything right now, but using what they know, what they see every day, I think would then trigger, let's say, spark, hey, I want to be an astronaut, versus, oh, astronauts are a white thing or a Western thing. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Okay, so maybe my next question is about how, because I don't think we can ever go back, in my opinion that is, we can ever go back to the way things were. We're going to be stuck in some in-between space. How, because there is need for maybe knowledge production that addresses these issues. How is your practice addressing these issues, or maybe addressing this possible in-between space?
Something simple. We are an oral people as Basotho, and I think as Africans, the whole concept of writing was introduced by missionaries for most of us, right? Before then, we still had storytelling, and we still had ways of transferring old knowledge to younger generations. So for us, we are tapping into that, people's ability to storytell. This is how we learn. This is how we know what people are thinking about in the villages and what kind of issues are kind of on people's minds. And that is our point of departure in terms of designing programming around that, like having workshops, doing research so that we can advocate for curriculum reform, so that the research that we have and the stories that we find can be incorporated into the curricula and then kind of start an evolution, I think, in terms of the way we imagine and the way we express ourselves and the way we're creative, and the way that kids see themselves and see their present. Because what is happening right now for most of us is that we think what is happening is permanent, it's normal, that this is how things are supposed to be, but that's not the case. You know, people need to recognize their power. People need to know that they have a voice so that they can be politically active, so that they can transform their society.
Maybe you can talk a little bit more about another roadmap school, what kind of work you are doing, and if you are engaging with policymakers, how far have you gone, and how far do you still have to go?
So another roadmap focuses on arts education because, you know, we view art as creative cultural expression. And culture is not defined by what your great-grandparents were doing. It's about how you live, it's what you wear, it's how you speak, who you hang out with, where you hang out, your interests, that's culture. And that is such an important aspect of who we are that it needs to be part of our learning, because that's how knowledge is created and generated. So we work in different spaces, focusing on different disciplines. I focus on language and storytelling. And so what we've done in Lesotho is began going to meetings with agencies like UNESCO, meeting with government bodies that deal with our areas of interest, and introducing what we've created as learning units based on our research to say, hey, maybe these can be tried out as alternative learning devices, because what we're not trying to replace the curriculum, we're just trying to supplement what's already there, because we acknowledge that it takes a lot of work, and we acknowledge that it is necessary the way it is as far as formal education structures are concerned, but that is not the limit, because the true construct of school is to tell you how to think, not to teach you how to think. And we are about that alternative, like you should think for yourself, you should be critical, you should question things, you should dig deeper into things.
But when you speak about maybe dealing with language, I think that is the greatest part of our unlearning. We're speaking in English. I suppose it's a medium that we can both use because we don't have another common language.
It bridges a gap.
Yeah, but sometimes there are things that I can express quite clearly in my mother tongue that I can never translate into English. What are you actually doing with the language to make sure that, even because you seem to concentrate on children, I don't know why you're leaving the adults out, to make sure that whatever you're doing, it goes a lot further?
Because the children are the future. And also, okay, so we have a project where we are campaigning for people to invent new words. We noticed a dearth in, you know how these new terminologies coming up, and then what we do is just kind of localize it. In my language, we'd say we sotify it, right? So television becomes television, you know what I mean? Instead of us thinking, hey, what would we call this in our language in a way that makes sense, right? So we have designed workshops around that, where we come together and kind of just brainstorm ideas, and then words come from there. Somebody might come with like a root, somebody might come with it, something, a middle or whatever, and then it becomes a word. And the way we structured them was to also encourage them to draw, right? So we were doodling as we were creating these words. In another workshop, we brought in magazines to trigger a thoughtfulness when we look at images, because visual literacy is also quite important. Part of our colonization is in how we have been represented back to ourselves. When you see images of Africa, it's the child with the fly. You know, it is the,
With the foot around the
oh Lord, or like snot across their face. It's the woman in the village next to the vegetable patch, or carrying a child on her back. And this is how we know ourselves, and this is how the world knows us. But we know different. We know that we're in a gallery right now, you know, and that cameras around, and that does not define our. But then newspapers also, how they present news, how they present stories to people in such a way that, first of all, their first priority is to make you buy the paper, right? So how are they manipulating their placement and their choice of imagery to get you there? You know, and how, like there was this one in particular where there was a strike in Lesotho. The textile workers wanted a salary increase from 1,000 something rand to 2,020 rand. That's very little money, but the government was not willing to negotiate. So these people protested and went to the streets, and it was wild, like it was insane. Ultimately, they got what they wanted. But the newspapers, one paper says something like textile workers get justice. Others say textile workers are destructive. Others say textile workers destroy public property because they had. So you see how they're framing these stories. And you have to question like the intention behind that, like, okay, why do they want to tell this side of the story? Is it a diversion from the actual bigger conversation, or what's the motive? So bringing all these conversations into these workshops, then we're like, okay, how would you create a word for visual misrepresentation, you know? And then we play, you know, there's music playing in the background, we're drawing and whatever, so it's also fun, and it triggers something that's natural to all of us. We all started learning by playing before we were in school, before we were writing in notebooks. And those are the kind of things that we kind of try to tap into as we encourage knowledge creation and learning.
Okay. You still didn't answer my question about the adults.
Well, I said the children are the future.
But they are raised by adults.
But here's the thing with the adults, right? The kids actually drag their parents over to this thing, interestingly enough. And the parents, depending which age group you're talking to, initially when we came with these ideas, it was like, you children and your things, you want to ruin our culture, it's this westernization. So that's kind of like, come on, I'm a product of how you raised me. So you're the one who took me to an English medium. What you were saying about some things you can express better in your language, some of us can't say that, because English was it was drilled into us that sometimes I find myself stuttering when I have to speak in my own language to people that don't speak English. And that's a challenge, and that's like a real identity crisis, So it's very complex. That's why we don't talk to the parents.
Okay. Going back to specifically about your practice, how does your practice address questions that problematize normative ideas of active citizenship? Sometimes people think active citizenship is one thing. Yeah.
Wow. That's a tough one. Look, there are current affairs. At any given time, there's always something that they have done. Just raise it in I did a workshop one time with South African kids when the day Jacob Zuma resigned. And it was a creative writing workshop. And the exercise we gave them was, okay, you know what's happening today, great. Do some research about Jacob Zuma. Write a paper about him as to why he should stay in power. And then halfway through, I told them to write the opposite of what they wrote. They were pissed. But the point was to get them to look at both sides of an argument, like debate, like we were taught, you know what I mean? And even those that didn't want to say anything overtly, in their writing, did show it what they thought. There's also nuance, there's also reading between the lines kind of thing. And we also opened it up, like for those who don't want to use words, you can draw. You can write a song, you can write a poem, it can be in any form, just tell a story. Yeah.
Okay, so that's how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I feel like for you personally that language is a contested space. Besides another roadmap, what are you doing as an intervention to engage with contested spaces? And this is much broader than the language. It's also other aspects of the history of your country and colonial institutions.
I'm outspoken. And when there are cultural events taking place, I will ask a question. I will pay attention. I write about the things that concern me. And I work with friends and peers back home who are interested in the same matters, who are doing things in their different practices. And I think that united front also counts for something. Yeah, it's, yeah, I'll keep it short. Yeah.
And are you engaging with other communities of protest and other forms of production that have moved away from Western models?
That's the intention. The thing with where we come from, or where I come from, By we, I mean me and my guardians. Um, no, no. You know, we're diplomatic people. We are very polite and know your place, basically, you know. And protests, I don't know, I think protest happens when when they reach their limit. And that is very rarely. But things like, we had a teacher strike this year. Like, for most of this year, our kids were not in school. And that was a strike that I stood in solidarity with and I wrote about as well. And when you get on the internet, you see all kinds of protests happening around the world. And if you have a network, you know how the people in those locales are doing whatever. And if it's within your means to do something, to contribute, then you can. It could be an idea, it could be funds, it could be something. You don't necessarily have to be there. But I think learning about it and knowing and having a consciousness about it, about what's going on around you, I think that's the first step. And that's what we try to encourage through our dialogues and through our discourse.
I think I'm going to ask the audience to ask some questions.
Are there some instances when you feel that, as we talk of decolonization, when you feel that morality has to be legislated? Are there instances where you think that is necessary? Because if we seem to, or if we push for a free rolling lifestyle where there is no deliberate legislation of some parts of morality. You talk about the children, and you continue to emphasize on the children. And if certain things are not legislated, to what extent do you think that will help the upbringing of the children and protect them?
I believe in structure, right? And structure comes in many forms of how discipline is instilled in a person. Don't tell me to be a good person because it's the Christian thing to do. Tell me to be a good person because it's the right thing to do, right? Some of the best people in my life have no experience of Christianity, yet they're kind, they're generous, they are pious, if you want to call it that. You won't see them free rolling in the streets. And I think we need that clarity. I think it's also why when some people leave the church, they end up being horrible people, doing terrible things, or people who are doing terrible things in the cloth, you know, hiding behind the cloth. So yes, we need regulation. How it's enforced and what it is based upon does require a bit of interrogation. If you beat a child, you're traumatizing that child. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't discipline your child.
Thank you, everyone. We meet again on Monday for another conversation. We are rethinking epistemics. And thank you, Daniel,